The next roundtable will be by Mr. Jordi Salas Salvadó, and he will introduce the topic.
Muy buenas tardes.
Then, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you very much, Carmen, for this introduction of the event. Well, as moderator of this round table, which is a pleasure for me to be chairing today and to moderate today, I am very satisfied by the fact, because I'm going to moderate three guests that have worked this topic profoundly. This session has the title Dietetic Patterns, Health, Environment and Social Challenges. And these three speakers, some of them are well known, several years already. Some of them I've met through literature and also through their papers, scientific papers they have published, and some of them well, I didn't know that I already had the knowledge about them, but today we have been able to meet and have been able to see that through other persons we already knew about each other. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about each of them and give a little bit of information of the speakers. The first topic we are going to talk about is the present dietary habits and the epidemiological implications on health and environment. And our speaker is Dr. Carlos Gonzalez Svatetz. He is very well known since many years. He is a personal friend of more than 30 years. He is and has been a great researcher. He is emeritus researcher of the Catalan Institute of Oncology, Barcelona, Spain. He has been the coordinator of the prospective study EPIC, as you're familiar with, which is a huge and relevant study around cancer with more than 500,000 individuals on European level, followed up several years, 135 papers published, and there's so many other persons who are addressing nutrition. At the end of our life, we focus on the aspects of environment and sustainability. And many of the researchers I know also do the same, and they have also given the relevance to the fact that we can turn the food and nutrition into a food more based on vegetables, because many of the relevant researchers I know and I've met, and I always remember Harvard or Norma Lindo University, at the group of Norma Lindo University, David Jenkins in Toronto, and so on and so on. Many of them are vegetarians or vegans, or they have fostered the relevance of going in that direction, and nutrition which is more based on vegetables. Further on, Carlos Gonzalez Svatetz has written a book on climate emergency, nutrition and health, which I really recommend, and from the Catalan Center of Nutrition, of which I am the president, he received his the Ramon Turró Award for his career, his research career. And the second speaker is Claudia Rocío Magaña González. Claudia is Doctor of Social Anthropology by the Michoacán College, and she is also a graduate in psychology in Mexico. At present, she is professor of the social work at the University of Barcelona. She has also been a researcher during 4 years at the University of Mexico. So one of my doctoranda knows her very well in Mexico, and today we have been able to meet really, which we didn't have been able to do before. At present, she is also part of the research group of the University of Barcelona of Health and Nutrition, and also of the Odella University, and also of the Catalan Institute of Anthropology, and she focuses on food, nutrition in sensitive areas of society in Spain. And she is going to give us a lot of information on this topic. And the third speaker who is going to connect in streaming is Dr. Helen Harvard, who is, well, I've met her just recently, 20 minutes ago. I knew a lot about her through different papers, 2 or 3 papers I have read and she has written, and it is a real pleasure to have her amongst us today. She is a senior researcher of the energy program of the Chatham House Food, and also an associate of the climate policy of the University of Harvard of the United States. And Dr. Helen Harvard focuses on, well, her studies address the changes of the nutrition models to be able to fulfill the requirements of Paris in our food profiles that minimize the impacts of food on the environment and also address many, many ethical topics. She has an important career on her back in environmental ones in Loma Linda University, first of all, and further on also in the Investigation Institute of the Leeds University in the UK, investigating how to mitigate the climate change. She is a very frequent panelist around the world. She is part of many events and conferences, and she is at present also a member of one of these sections of the food department, nutrition department of the World Health Organization. She's going to talk about food and nutrition and biodiversity, which is going to give us the information on how we will be able to make this real change. And well, let's start immediately with the first speaker. I would like to remind them that they have 20 minutes, and please stick to the timetable. And at the end, we will have question and answer session. Questions, we would like to ask you to participate also if you are logging in online. Carlos, you're going to talk about the present habits and the present dietary habits and also the epidemiological impacts on health and environment.
¿Está activado el micrófono? Sí. Bien. Gracias, Jordi, por tu...
Yes, thank you very much, Jordi, for this introduction, and also thank you, Instituto de Danone, for inviting me so that I can participate at the second symposium. And of course, I would also like to ask the Institute, thank them also for organizing this second symposium. In my opinion, it's absolutely essential to organize it, as we have seen in the survey and the outcomes, the lack of knowledge amongst the health professionals. So it's important to focus and go profoundly into this topic, not only on the effect of this problem, but also the possible solutions to mitigate the effect of food and nutrition combined with climate change. Well, this said, personally, I would like to start briefly talking about this topic they have given me for my presentation, for my speech. It's not easy to talk in only 20 minutes on a topic which is so complex and so broad. Hue has talked about the statement or the definition of the FAO, what is sustainability. I think that there are 4 components. We have, first of all, that they have a low climate impact, another component which is to be healthy, another component which in my opinion is also very important, which is that it must be affordable, access for the whole population, and then it must also based on vegetables and not only on shrimps and insects, which is not very acceptable in our cultural framework. So I would like to start with the presentation of information on the relevance of food on human health. This is one of the most important studies that have been run in the world, and it is the global impact of diet on health in 195 countries of the world, and it was published on the Lancet in 2019. And as you can see here, the red columns on, or the bars on the right is the impact on the deaths. Red is impact on cardiovascular diseases. We also have a red or pink color impact on diabetes, on cancer, and other causes. And as you can see here in this huge study, they found in 195 countries that there were 11 million deaths that are attributable to the diet in these 195 countries. That represents that, in fact, at least 1 of 4 deaths have died due to a problem linked to the diet. And when you analyze what kind of most important foods or products or producers that are important, only 3 that are the ones of all these chronic diseases. Only 3 are the ones. The most important foods is natrium high diet, and then low in grains and low in fruit. These are the 3 profiles which are important, which are in fact responsible for these deaths. And this is very important to take into account when we talk about the impact on the health, on the population of the world. When we talk about the present dietary or nutritional profile or model, other things that are of concern for the scientific community and citizenship is the relationship or the link between this nutrition and obesity in the world. If we look at the outcomes, the results in this graph, we can see that we 800 million inhabitants of the world that have chronic malnutrition. 800 million inhabitants of the world, which are concentrated mainly in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. But it's not exclusive of these continents. These are figures of this, and we have figures of the Spanish government. We have 27% of children in Spain that also have the nutrition in moderate poverty. There are also 500 million of people that have obesity, which have an influence. They have the impact of what we can call at present, well, they have a hypercaloric diet that avoids calories and junk food. Diet is a topic which is addressed also in the framework of the Ukrainian war. Ukraine and Russia are the countries that give 30% of the consumption of grains and cereals in the world. But this is something coming from the past. If you look at these figures of the FAO in these last years, from 2010 to 2018 and 19, as you can see in these graphs, we have a graph that is stabilizing, it's flattening, but in the last 2 years, it coincides with the development of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there we have a really a rough increase. And then climate change, which is also something, a topic, a factor with relevance, not only due to droughts and flooding and wars in the world, which of course is the consequence of the also shifting of the populations looking for water and so on. It shows us that the CO2 levels have a relevance on, this is a study about rice, so it has the important relevance on the concentration of protein, iron, zinc, and other vitamins, B1, B2, B5, B9, which reduce the concentration in rice, which is one of the basic foods globally, and it is due to the climate change. So the landscape we have can be characterized by this Lancet report of 2019, which addresses an world endemia, which is a set of pandemics. It's an endemic, so it's a set of pandemics. What does that mean? What are the pandemics that are of concern to humanity nowadays? On the one hand, we have obesity, as I've mentioned before, malnutrition, and climate change. And the report, which has been published in the Lancet, which has been done by different universities of the world and have acknowledged it several years ago. So, one of the other characteristics of this present nutrition model, this is also figures of the Lancet 2007. It is regarding the consumption of meat by regions of the world. As you can see here, if we look at the emerging countries, there we have a consumption of 47 grams per person per day, and the levels of the industrial countries, we have 224. So it is how many times more in the industrial and developed countries if we compare it with the emerging countries. When what is in fact recommended internationally is 70 grams per day per person. So we have a situation in the world where we have an excess of the consumption of meat in the developed countries, and we have a deficit of the consumption of meat in the countries which are emerging regions. And this is a trend, a tendency in the same paper in the Lancet, published in the Lancet, that also proves the growth, or what could also be the prospection of the growth of the consumption here. We do not only have of meat, but also of animal origin in developed countries and in Latin America, the Caribbean, east of Asia. As you can see, almost in all of them there is an increase, which for 2050 is, let's say, explosive. And the whole scientific community acknowledges this growth, which is unsustainable. It cannot be sustained. It cannot continue growing, this consumption of the food of animal origin in this size, in this dimension. Going more into detail of what is the impact of what we are saying, the impact of food nutrition, taking into account the framework of the greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions. I think that this paper is very important because there's an estimate between the 21 and 27% of this greenhouse gases are originated in our food model. So practically it represents a third of the origin of climate change is really due to our nutrition. And why? Why can we say that nutrition, that food is important? Why essentially what in fact is the production of animal proteins, the consumption of meat? Let's say that on the international level, these are figures of the FAO. We have three greenhouse gases, which are the most important ones: CO2, NO2, and methane. And where are they really produced? 1/3 is comes from the deforestation. Deforestation represents, well, all the forests that disappear, and to use it for the growing of crops that then are used 30% for the consumption by animals, not by humans. And these forests disappear, and these forests, in fact, when they are destroyed, are the ones that have absorbed the CO2 of the atmosphere, and the fact that they are destroyed, this CO2 goes back into our atmosphere. The same happens and has happened with the important forest fires in Australia, California in the past 2 years. In Australia, there was so much CO2 back into the atmosphere, equivalent to UK in 1 year. So can you imagine how important it has been? The other source is basically what is manure, which generates NTO, so NO, And then we also have the enteric fermentation of ruminants, which is the production of methane, and that is also generated in the same area, the same context of manure. So that is the origin, and that is the relevance of the different gases if we are talking about this global part of proteins of animal origin. And this is a paper of a group, Poor and Nimertek, but it is published in a magazine of the Oxford University that publishes and provides scientific information on the relevance of the greenhouse gases in production. As we can see here, food is a third, and here we also have the different sources, and I have not time enough to go into details of each of them, but only to remark here, because it is a topic we have just mentioned before, that one of the definitions that the health professionals use also, that the sustainable food is proximity nutrition. And that is, of course, a problem all of us who are in this world, are active in this world, recommend also. And here we have the figures. 1 kilo of orange, which is transported 50 kilometers, increases the emissions in 4%. But if I transport it 1,500 kilometers of a distance, then it increases 80% the emissions. And if I take it by plane 6,000 kilometers of distance, then it increases 10 times this impact it has. 1 kilo of oranges, and that is the why. That is the reason why proximity production is so important. When we are consuming produce that is coming from Brazil, Costa Rica, Latin America, we must take into account the impact it has. At the same time, when we are, for example, seeing the production we have of the south of Spain, Almeria, where we have the orchard in Murcia that goes to the north of Europe, then it goes in trucks that will go thousands of kilometers of distance to bring their produce there. So this is another study I would like to share with you. This is a Spanish one. We have published it in the European magazine in 2020. Here we can see the origin of the 40,000 citizens in Spain and the how they impact on the greenhouse gases for each of the food they consume. Here, for example, we have 40%, which is red meat and processed meat, 20% is dairy products. So 60%, if we add it together, is originated by food that is consumed, let's say, in this framework of animal origin. If you compare it to the vegetable origin, we can see here fruit, vegetables, cereals, grains, legumes represent less than 15% of the greenhouse gases that are produced by our food. This can be seen here. A meta-analysis, the same authors I have mentioned before, meta-analysis of 119 countries. As you can see, well, we have the meat and the different versions we have. It's the most important impact. And you see the different types of meat and the impact, the pertinent impact. And there, very down in this graph, the vegetable origin, which had a very low impact. I would like to talk a little bit about several concepts, which is the relevance of the greenhouse gases, emissions, and but not only that, also for the use of land and the consumption of water. This is a paper that has been published and compares the different dietary patterns, the vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean diet, the different amount of studies where they have evaluated the emissions, the use of the land, the use or consumption of water, which is linked with it. What can we see here? These dietary patterns of Ghana, for example, the vegan one, yes, going back to the figures. Here we have the vegan profile, vegetarian and Mediterranean ones. These show us the relative reduction of CO2 emissions of each of them. They are all healthy from the perspective of the environmental impact. But what we can see here, a higher impact is the vegan one, then the vegetarian one, and then followed by the Mediterranean one. This is another paper which is going in the same line. Here, one of the authors, and Jordi Sabatté, and from the Jawalinda University, it's a Catalan who has worked there, and has also, since several years, been focusing on dietary and nutrition topics. And here we have the impact of what is the ovo dairy vegan diet, vegetarian diet, and then we have the vegan diet, and the use of land and also the use of water, and have a very important impact. One of the most important studies of what is the impact of the sustainable diet is one of the papers of Nature 2014. What can we see here? They compare different dietary patterns, for example, the Mediterranean one, based on fish, vegetarian, Mediterranean, as you can see. On the level of impact on diseases, diabetes, type 2, cancer, coronary and heart diseases, and then the general mortality reduction, well, relative reduction we are talking about. So it's the reduction generated by these dietary patterns, which essentially are based on products that are basically have a vegetable origin and have a low consumption of animal origin. And each of these profiles have a little bit different impact, but they are all healthy. And then there are other papers and other publications on what is the impact directly of the diet in the framework of the CO2 emissions of the consumption they have, and with a direct impact on health. And one of the first I would like to share, a few other first was one of ours, of the Barcelona group. But the most important one is the EPIC report of European Union, which has been published in the Lancet Planetary Health in 2001. We wrote a letter to the Lancet Planetary Health, and it was published this spring, because in the epic of this report, what have we found? We have found a reduction of mortality. We have also, when we were comparing a diet which was high on CO2, and then here we have the high one, high concentration, 30% of increase, cardiovascular diseases and mortality, plus 90% cancer mortality, 60% cancer incidence, plus 11%. And then the EPIC cohort of Spain, what we found additionally is the impact on the incidence and also the incidence of the acute cardiac infarct. And I have still two left, with which I'm going to finish my speech, and I would like to mention this one. This is the report of the EAT Lancet Commission on Food, Planet and Health. It is also in the framework of Harvard, and I think it is one of the most complete reports. And I would like to finish with these graphs. On the one hand, you can see that we have the traditional pyramid of the Mediterranean diet, which is the important one regarding health, with all the vegetable origins we have in these foods on the first level, and then the food of animal origin that should be consumed in a lesser amount. If we look at the climate change impact, here the ones that generate less, and on the contrary, here we see the food of animal origin are the ones that have the highest impact. And to finish, just a thought, which in my opinion is important. This is a paper of Science of 2020. Here you can see this paper where they estimate in the Science report that to fulfill the target of not surpassing the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris Treaty, and if possible not reaching 2 degrees, is that we have to look at the energy sources. So we have to replace the fossil energy sources by other ones. And it's also essential, in their opinion, to change our nutrition model. Without this change, we will not be able to fulfill the Paris Treaty. And I think that that is the most important conclusion we have to remember. Why is it so important to remember? Because in Spain, last year, for the first time, it was very positive. For the first time, we had a law for climate change. This law is focusing almost exclusively on the topic of energy, fossil energy, and alternative energies. They are not talking, not one word on the impact of food on climate change. And I think that is very important to acknowledge it and take it into account, because as we have seen in the Science with these papers, without this additional change, if you want to combat the climate change, we won't see the results we want to achieve without also a change in our food model. And with these words, I finish my speech. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Vamos a continuar con el siguiente ponente al final.
Thank you very much, Carlos. We're going to continue with next speaker. Now we give the floor to Claudia Rocío Magaña, who is going to speak the state of food safety in Spain, challenges in order to achieve affordability and accessibility of sustainable diets.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias.
So thank you very much. Thank you for the kind invitation. Let me also tell you that I'm coming, or at least I wanted to share with you part of the results that not only we have been developing since the year 2015 with the working party of the University of Barcelona, and to complete and present a report that together with Dr. Ana Morales, who wanted to be here but was not able to be here with us, who is directing this study on food safety in Spanish households, and which was presented in February of this year in Madrid. So, first of all, I would like to thank all the attendees, the organizers, and the Danone Institute in order for us to share these reflections. And the speakers and those of us meeting here are interested and have been working for many months in order to understand nutrition from many different perspectives, and also from a multidisciplinary perspective. And here I think that the work I want to share with you, which is the results of a joint effort, comes from a perspective where we place most important in aspects related to social impacts, because we often think that nutrition is just consumption or production or distribution, as if nutrition were not a fundamental activity of life to sustain us and to sustain us as a society. And it has been the main axis of organization and disorganization of our lives. In that sense, I wanted to recover this idea. What do we know about feeding and foods during crisis? But not only nutrition in numbers, because what we knew were some numbers during the economic crisis back in 2008 until 2015, where it seemed that the situation was beginning to become more stable in our country. From food banks, we have numbers saying that some people were at the situation of food poverty, without access to food. And this is why the question is, are we thinking about nutrition for everyone, really? And in that sense, this social list wants to place the emphasis on the fact that we are very privileged ones, and we speak from privilege. And sometimes we see the non-privileged or the vulnerable due to an unequal system as numbers, and it's very difficult to get to know their experiences. In this sense, the two reports try to contribute with a more sensible approach in order to rethink nutrition and health, and sustainability has to come from the heart of people, but from a perspective of a dignified life. What happened during lockdown? Well, what we already knew. There was a problem we had not named before, because here in Spain, food insecurity was just of lack of nutrition, and not a problem of the third world, which is access. And the hues of hunger reflected this situation. Food banks were telling us that there is 1.5 million people who went to food banks during the period of lockdown, which speaks of a very critical situation. But sometimes, because we don't name it, or because we don't recognize the existence of this problem, we don't recognize we are living in an unequal country, it's very difficult to recognize or try to understand what's happening. As I was saying, since the year 2015, a report that we launched, I don't know if you can see the details of my slide, but since we started working from the research work in vulnerable contexts, from social work, we were thinking about the impact of crisis, especially in 2018 families. We were working here in Barcelona, recovering some important data, one qualitative study where we wanted to know where these vulnerable groups were living. And these were families, single parent families, and people belonging to the third age. And we found out that families were developing hundreds of strategies to face this situation of food insecurity or not being able to access food. We were encountering problems along the food process about how to obtain foods, how to prepare them, or when they were consumed. For example, as far as food accessibility, the purchasing power was limited, restricted access to several foods such as variety, organization of the shopping list has to be restructured within households, and foods of social origin were revalued, and many of these families were going to the systems and responses related to food grants. From a manufacturing point of view, the type of food was replaced by frozen products, and we were asking ourselves from other perspectives what's happening to people. Why is there so much obesity because of an unequal access? Foods were non-structured or have become non-structured within families. Many families have to reduce the amount of food. Some of us have the privilege to choose to eat 5 times a day. Some families only once, and only at critical periods, or maybe having to prepare one meal for the whole family. Avoid food waste, of course, by preparing some food, so creativity was activated within families, going back to traditional foods, which is much cheaper, or at least if you receive 1 kilogram of flour, for example, to make a traditional bread is easier than buying a bread loaf, which will cost you 1.70 at a good bakery, and then diversifying the different ways to prepare foods, especially those coming from these subsidies. Why am I talking about this type of subsidies for foods? Because sometimes we think that traditional ways of helping people allow us to move forward, but depending on the types of foods they receive, because many of them come from a system where, well, they come from the food industry, And many of these foods are not fresh. They are very perishable. So the diversity of foods ends up being very unequal, or meats which are not able to access in these baskets or through these food subsidies. I'm thinking about food banks, which carry out a very important task. Families, from food consumption, families recognize that this is a source of important resources in order to obtain and being able to guarantee its nutrition, and they recognize how important this is, but it's not always culturally adapted, as it has been mentioned in the previous study. So the cultural adaptability is not always ensured in this type of responses. So I'm not going to go much longer. Unfortunately, one of the things that we recognize is that it generated impacts from a personal experience of the family, and we have several articles where we have been able to publish not only these results, but yes, we have been able to establish a dialogue with different spaces in the city in order to speak about the different responses that have been generated, and we find other interesting answers, such as the cash cards, which open possibilities for these people to access foods in a less directed way, as it happens with food banks. And there is a transformation from the perspective of responses and within the same institutions. This vision is changing. It's going from assistance to empowering and centered in the dignity of people.
But well, this was qualitative and local, but on an urban level study. But what happens then if we look at it? And our present situation, and Dr. Carlos has mentioned already, COVID pandemic has showed us all these inequalities, obesity in children, where there is a low-income family, for example, 40% of kids that have these problems. Then also death to the of diets that are not correct and are not fulfilling these requirements. And that's important to take into account. But here we have the third of the greenhouse gases are produced by this kind of profiles. And that's why I think that the relevance of the symposium is so important for scientists, so that we can make our voice hear. But how can we do that? How can we achieve that? Because we are seeing it. We will see it these 2 days of a conference, that the social and environmental impacts of the global food model shows us that there is a need of transformation towards sustainable foods in the production, to transform, to process, and to consume, and to transport, and also the impact on the whole world, on citizens and on the environment. We work with Dr. Ana Morales, and what we were looking for was something that was based on the need to find indicators that could tell us what is the status of the food safety. But one thing is to have an urban study with certain features that would allow us to go into details of how these families are really feeling it, seeing it. But something completely different is to see a national impact. We saw that there was the possible measurements, but it was only partial. Life quality, for example, the influences based on KPIs, but also the development of social unbalances and inequities, and also what we see in the Observatory of Food in Madrid, or, for example, the Institute of Public Health in Barcelona. So we found several references and figures of the different neighborhoods where we could see differences. But a really broad study to see what is the food safety in families on a national level was something we could not find. To be able to compare with these benchmarks of the FAO, and when they use that definition, if a person does not have a regular access to proper food, they cannot have a proper development and achieve a healthy life. And what we found is that maybe the experience of this food insecurity is something that can be tracked through the different results sources, but it is difficult to find. It's kind of the tip of the iceberg, which is hiding many other problems that take us to understand that it is much more complicated than just provide food. It has to do with certain foods. For example, there is an impact on a psychological level, quality of life, the development of stress, it's food stress. Many women have shared the experience with us, the stress that was triggered when they were thinking about what am I going to give my kids tomorrow to eat, what kind of food, what will I have, and that is one of the consequences or one of the outcomes of the study. And one of the recommendations after carrying out the study was exactly that, because we saw that we had finally the figures we needed, and that was what we was looking for with the study. It is available on the site of the University of Barcelona. We have there a landing page. You can download it. It is of public access, and what we wanted to find is scientific evidence of food insecurity, and we were very much interested in the fact before COVID and the fact after COVID. What was seen after the pandemic between July 2020 and July 2021? That was our period of measurements. And we also wanted to look at the Spanish family profile. We have used the Fields profile or scale. Those of you not familiar with it, that is a scale that is used by the FAO for more than 30 years. Hugo Melgano is a colleague from the university who developed it in Canada, and they have been working with it for many years in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they have been able to track and trace this status now, this profile of the families, and also to see if it is possible to change the situation. It was not something that was known here, or the use of it or the utility of it was not known here. And then there were also other important components, or in our opinion very important, which is the aid, the support we could give. What kind of support do they receive? What kind of support we're talking about? And I would like to highlight this point. We talked about the public, private support, the financial one, and also in kind, meaning food, food banks and so on. And then also the impact on these dietary habits we're talking about. The methodology, I don't want to go into details, but it is a telephone survey. There were interviews, almost more than 1,350 families, 1,350 interviews, and in fact, that was the basis with which we have worked to find the outcomes. What did we find with this study? Well, in the last year, since July 2020 until July 2021, apparently, there is 80% of these families of households that say they don't have food insecurity. Well, maybe 80% are saying, yes, everything is okay. But where it changes is exactly here. Why? Because there's 87, 86%, 80% who tell us they have no food insecurity. Before the COVID pandemic, we were talking about 88, so there was a decrease here. I know I just several minutes left. What did we find? Well, due to COVID, there was an increase specifically in those families or households or those persons that they ate less. They had an access to less food and products. And another characteristic of families, households, and their food insecurity, the total of households that did not have this insecurity were not in a precarious employment situation, but those households with problems of employment had apparently a situation which was not a precarious situation. So then, regarding the fact that a member of the family had or was unemployed, or there was a lack of employment, there it was important, there was an increase. There was a 24% of these households that told us that part of the members of the family were unemployed, but 29.8% had a person, or one of the relatives, one of the members of the family, which was unemployed or had problems finding an employment. Specifically in the figures here, when we're talking about households with unemployment and also food insecurity, there we have 33.3% with food insecurity, had all their members of the family unemployed. And here we have another important element. Very briefly, we asked also about equipment and means to be able to cook. Well, in the households with food insecurity, we found that they had the equipment, but they restricted the use, and 2.1% did not have the proper equipment. We do not only need access to food, we also need the tools, we need the equipment to be able to cook and process the food. And we don't have the follow-up of these figures, but statistically significant figures of insecurity is also discapacity, and also in the same households, and most of them told us we cannot eat 5 times per day, and or we have to reduce also the use of the equipment to cook. And this was a very important point, in my opinion. I would like to remark it here. We asked them all, do you receive a support or not? And now I'm going to emphasize the households with food insecurity. But if we look at the figures which are red, we can see that those households with the food insecurity that receive a support, a financial support, 36.4% receive it by family, and 17.3% are receiving it from neighbors, friends, and so on. 68% of these households receive monetary or financial support from the public authorities. In the households that receive specifically food aid for the access to food, we have found that the variable of self-consumption is the 14.2% of the households with food insecurity, and that of the 16.1% of the food bank or from friends and relatives and other families is more than 2%. I would like to go into detail of these figures. Just 1 minute left. Well, the fact is that food insecurity is a structural problem, that it has increased, okay, that's true, that it could represent this 11.9% to 30.3%. It can be increased of 600,000 persons in a situation of food insecurity. 30.3% of the Spanish households have a certain amount of insecurity, 2.5 million households. So that means that we have almost 2,500,000 people. It's a very important figure. And then if we see that 5.2% of the Spanish families have this 13.3%, 5.2% of the Spanish households have this moderate or severe food insecurity and have had this lack due to a lack of resources. That means that these persons had to reduce their food intake due to a situation of insecurity. And another important point is that the socioeconomic low-income families have most difficulties to make ends meet. And that is what we can really take out of this result. And then if it is this capacity also involved, then it is even worse, and that there are other studies that can give us more emphasis. The supports that they receive, 57% of these households receive supports from the public administration, public authorities of the total. That means that at least almost, 57% of the Spanish households is a representative group, have or received the supports and depends on this food supports. Supports, generally speaking, from the public or private authorities or private part of the society. And then we have 30% of these direct supports as coming from family, relatives, friends, and so on. Then 4% of the household declares that they have no food insecurity. Almost 1.9 million persons receive the support, and their statement is that they do not have food insecurity. So maybe it has to do with the fact that partially it is mitigated by this feeling of having this support, of receiving this support. What would happen if this social support would finish? What would happen with these very huge percentages that are now being traced as stating that they do not have this food insecurity? So they receive the support, but they do not have the feeling that they are in that situation. Then we think that it is a rather good tool. We do not guarantee in Spain the right to food. It's not the proper one, and we're very far away of achieving the requirements we have to fulfill if we continue with this tendency of the fact that the households have this food insecurity. We have to acknowledge the differences, we have to measure them, we have to give the support, and we have to fight against these insecurities and inequalities using different actors of the market and taking decisions to address it qualitatively and of the different levels, social and so on. But it is necessary to be able to make it visible, to show really that we have this problem and that the problem really exists.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a pasar.
Thank you very much. We are now going to listen to next speaker. Would like to do it in English. No, he can do it in English.
La presentación. El siguiente ponente es a cargo de Helen Harvard.
Next speech is going to be given by Helen Harwatt, and the title is Food Systems and Loss of Biodiversity. Thank you very much for participating in streaming.
Apologies everybody for those technical issues. It's great to be with everybody today. Thanks so much to the organisers for including this issue in a nutrition conference. It's much appreciated. So today I'm going to look at the role of food system transformation in climate and biodiversity plans. So we'll be looking at two existential threats instead of one. So I just want to warn you that you might feel thoroughly depressed at least once during this presentation, but please bear with us as it does get much more positive in the second half of the talk. So let's start with climate change. So of course, climate change is a major environmental issue, but it's also a major public health issue as recognised by the World Health Organization, who classes climate change as the greatest threat to public health this century. So there's a really strong relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and wealth, which was also further highlighted in the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We already have temperature rise over 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and that is already having negative impacts. There's also a relationship between the impacts that we could see and temperature rise. So for example, the impacts at 1.5 degrees would be worse than they are at current temperatures, but not as bad as the impacts that we could see if temperatures go to 2 degrees or more. There's also that the impacts would be great if temperature overshoots 1.5 degrees and then returns to 1.5 degrees at some point this century, which is quite a popular pathway, at least in the policy arena. And this is because basically the more temperatures increase, the more that we actually risk destabilizing major ecosystems. So for example, here you can see those ecosystems in yellow indicate the ecosystems that are at risk between 1 and 3 degrees of temperature rise, and they include major ice sheets. And of course you can see all these feedback loops indicating their links to other major ecosystems. So essentially, the more that we risk destabilizing them and they become destabilized, there's no guarantee that if we go back down to 1.5 degrees or lower, that those ecosystems will return to a stable state. So there's a major risk there. So the best option is really to adhere to the precautionary principle and the equity component of the Paris Agreement, which requires a maximum 1.5 degrees with no overshoot. So this requires somebody trying to communicate something. I can hear somebody speak. I can just hear somebody speaking. Okay, right, that seems fair. So this requires at least a 45% reduction in CO2 emissions globally by 2030, followed by reaching net zero by 2050. So of course, the progress report isn't positive right now. Emissions have risen by an average of 1.5% over the past decade every year. The current pledges to the Paris Agreement, so this is what all of the countries in the world are committing to actually do to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, would actually align with around 2.4 degrees temperature rise, so quite some way off that 1.5 degrees. And on our current trajectory, the chances of meeting the Paris goal could actually be depleted by 2030. So this coming year in November, we have COP27, where countries have the chance to revise their pledges, so basically align them with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and this is really the final opportunity to do that. So the coming decade is absolutely crucial for climate change action. So we need countries to increase their ambition fivefold for the 1.5 degree goal, threefold for 2 degrees. We need emissions to peak as soon as possible, which was actually 2020, so we're beyond that point now. We also need strong and rapid reductions before 2030, in addition to enhanced longer term commitments. And essentially, the more that we delay action now, we rely on future, currently improving technologies to remove emissions from the atmosphere. And as I've already said, that is high risk if we start to destabilize major ecosystems. We also need to tackle food emissions, and if we don't do that, we actually can't meet the climate goal. So currently the food system accounts for around a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And on the current trajectory, so business as usual trends, these would roughly double by 2050. And a recent analysis showed that even if fossil fuel emissions were immediately halted, the current trends in global food systems alone would prevent achieving that 1.5 degree target. So just to go into this a bit more, the livestock sector alone could use around half of the emissions budget, aligning with 1.5 degrees by 2030, or around a third of the emissions budget, aligning with 2 degrees. We can reduce those emissions somewhat through technology improvements, but that is really insufficient in comparison to the amount of reductions that are actually needed. So the production and consumption of animal products must be reduced. And if we do try and avoid action in this area, it would require other sectors to mitigate even more than is planned or realistic. And we can see from the remaining greenhouse gas emissions budget that there's really no wiggle room for any sector to not be playing its full role in emissions reduction. So we currently have less than 10 years of emissions budget remaining before we reach that 1.5 degrees target. And really important to point out that in addition to needing to stick to this emissions target, which requires deep and rapid reductions of emissions, we also need to remove large amounts of emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So somewhere around 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 this century. So just to go into that a little bit more, carbon dioxide removal. So as I said, this is essential to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees. All of the options currently being looked at do require large areas of land, and there are additional numerous challenges with the high-tech options such as the bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which essentially uses crops for fuel and takes those emissions before they're actually emitted to the atmosphere and stores them underground in disused geological formations such as gas wells. And in fact, the only option that we currently have that we could roll out at scale is to essentially restore lost vegetation, such as reforestation, for example. Of course, this option itself does require large areas of land. So then we have to ask the question, where would we actually restore all of this vegetation? And this is where agriculture comes in strongly again. So we can see here that we use around half of all habitable land for agriculture. Most of that is used for livestock production, around 78% of that land, in return for around 18% of all global calorie supply and 37% of all global protein supply. So we can see that we need radical action far beyond anything that's currently planned across all sectors, including food. So moving on to biodiversity loss, and I'm mainly going to draw here from a report that we published last year. And what we found is that basically biodiversity loss is accelerating. The last round of global biodiversity targets running from 2010 to 2020 were not achieved by any country. We have around 25% of species that are at risk of extinction and a further around 1 million more facing extinction within decades. And it's worth just pointing out how essential biodiversity is in order to maintain a habitable planet. So for example, terrestrial and marine ecosystems together remove around 60% of all carbon emissions from the atmosphere, and in doing that actually create a habitable temperature for us. And right now that's the only way that we can actually remove that amount of carbon from the atmosphere to keep those temperatures where they need to be. Food systems are the leading driver of biodiversity loss, and this is projected to increase going forward, with more than 1,000 more species projected to lose at least 25% of their habitats by 2050, and essentially meat production and consumption accelerates this the most. So it's worth just looking at how the food system is structured to drive supply and demand, which in the report we call the cheaper food paradigm. So essentially this is a series of vicious circles that drive a set of overlapping and often self-reinforcing mechanisms, with essentially the goal to increase food production at increasingly lower costs, which in turn increases demand and consumption. So more land needs to be converted to agriculture, and agriculture production needs to be further intensified. So one outcome of this is that grain production has now become cheap enough to actually feed to livestock in very large quantities, which has actually increased the consumption of animal products globally. This system also incentivizes the supply of low-price, calorie-dense, nutritionally poor foods, and the costs in terms of the health and environmental damage are actually put onto society in this system, which really just increases the vulnerability of the marginalized over the long term. And what we really need to be doing is bringing people out of poverty, putting the full costs onto the foods, and that will actually in turn make the best foods, if you like, so the fruits, vegetables, legumes, the cheapest foods as well. So food systems have a range of impacts on biodiversity. A major one that you probably are well aware of is habitat loss and land clearance. So food is a major driver of deforestation, accounting for around 80% of deforestation globally. Animal agriculture specifically is responsible or links to around 65% of land use change since 1960. And is currently linked to around 80% of deforestation in the Amazon. And there's a really important connection here between climate change and biodiversity loss. Of course, forests are a really important natural carbon sink, and also a really important area for biodiversity as well. We also have chemical pollution from the use of pesticides, fertilizers, and manure on land, which gets washed into waterways, causing a number of problems. We have a prevalence of monocultures, which essentially limit the diversity of food and habitats available for wildlife. We have the direct killing of wildlife. So for example, wolves that are perceived as predators, or in the UK, for example, we have a badger culling program because it's thought that badgers are linked to spreading tuberculosis among cattle. We also have the impacts of climate change, which we've seen food systems are a major driver of, and this, for example, can change habitats through fire or drought and cause wildlife to actually migrate to other areas and compete for resources with other wildlife. And it's worth pointing out again that animal agriculture has the biggest burden across all of these issues, and as we've seen, for very little contribution to the food system in terms of calories and protein. And I mean, the main reason why animal agriculture has this sort of oversized impact on the food system is that animal products are really inefficient to produce. So, for example, to produce 1 calorie of beef actually requires 37 calories of plants to do that. Pork requires 12 calories of plants. 1 calorie of chicken requires 9 calories of plants, and eggs and dairy each require 6 calories of plants. Globally, around a third of all crop calories are fed to animals, and in return, we get about 12% of those calories back as human edible food. So we actually lose around a third of all crop calories before that reaches anybody's plates, and this isn't included in the sort of well-known food waste issue that we talk about more regularly. One example in the US found that 67% of all calories produced are used for livestock feed. And if that land was instead reconfigured and the crop production was optimized for human health and least resources, that same area of land could actually feed twice as many people. So this is where we get more positive, hopefully, moving on to solutions. And there are some really strong synergies between the climate change and between tackling climate change and biodiversity loss through food system transformation. So in the report, we essentially identified these 3 key areas across food, land, and farming. So shifting to plant-based diets, of course, would reduce the impacts across the board. Food waste is also really important. So around a third of all food waste currently is, for food produced is currently wasted. And we also need to not basically bring any more land into agriculture to preserve existing habitats. But in addition to preserving land, we also need to restore vast areas of land that have already been converted to agriculture. And we also need to produce food in a much more nature-friendly way. And it's worth highlighting here that it's really the extent that we shift on that plant-based trajectory that would allow us to achieve those other points here. So, for example, shifting to plant-based basically means we need less agricultural land than we currently do, which means we can preserve existing habitats or not bring more land into agriculture, but also we could free up some agricultural land to restore some of those lost habitats and also give more space for more nature-friendly farming techniques. So some policy pathways to run through. I'll use this example that I first published in 2018 and then we followed up in 2020 as a call for policymakers in high-income and middle-income countries to implement these 4 key steps as part of their climate change commitment. And this was actually signed in agreement by over 100 leading scientists globally. So those 4 key steps are to peak livestock production, set reduction targets, shift to plant-based alternatives, and restore native ecosystems. So starting with the peak livestock, so we could see over the past 60 years, we've had a 3-fold increase in livestock production globally. So the first step really is to peak that production immediately. The second step is to set reduction targets against that livestock production, and we could do this in a number of ways. One way is to look at a worst first approach in terms of the highest greenhouse gas emitters, the highest land users, or the lowest sort of output to input ratio. And as an example, if we look at this from a greenhouse gas perspective globally, we would start with beef, for example, contributing around 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions, followed by dairy, which is about 4%, and then pig meat and so on. Obviously, this would look quite different depending on if it's a country and their sort of national agricultural production inventory. That might look quite different to how this looks globally. And similarly, if it's an institution such as a university that's looking at their food purchase data, this could look quite different. And similarly, if an individual wanted to look at their own consumption from this worst first perspective. So third, shift to sustainable and healthy alternatives using a best available food approach, which essentially requires us to replace livestock products to maximize greenhouse gas reductions, minimize other environmental impacts, and maximize positive health outcomes. Pulses are likely to be very important in this third step. And finally, to restore lost carbon sinks, so restoring native vegetation cover, which would sequester carbon, helping to meet climate goals, but also providing additional benefits to biodiversity. And just to give you an example of what that could actually look like globally, we published this paper last year where we essentially looked at two scenarios. First of all, returning all permanent pasture land and animal feed cropland to its native vegetation cover, which was either forest or grassland. And secondly, to look at the impact of 3 different dietary scenarios on that global picture. So we essentially used data from existing data sets from the published literature. We spatially mapped the distribution of agricultural production, so permanent pasture and feed crops. We allocated the crops to food and feed, estimated the carbon content of existing vegetation and lost vegetation, and then looked at the impact of those 3 dietary scenarios. So this is what that looks like globally. So essentially, this green that you can see is the carbon that is currently not being sequestered due to the current land use, which is either permanent pasture land for livestock or animal feed crops. And the darker green essentially indicates a higher deposit of carbon in that area. So even Ireland here, which is considered very green, could actually be quite a lot greener under this scenario. And pasture land actually accounts for around 72% of that green there that you can see. So that would be the biggest opportunity for restoring. So in terms of income, I mean, this was really, I think, for me, the most interesting outcome. So we looked across different income groups, and what we found is around 70% of that sequestration potential actually occurs in high and upper middle income countries, which is really important, linked back to the previous point about the relationship between wealth and high emissions, and really points to that leading role that high income countries could play in tackling these issues. So like I said, we have about 70% of that restoration potential in high and upper middle income countries, and that's essentially because we've already changed the land so much in those countries that we have the most potential to restore it. And lastly, the 3 dietary patterns. So we have business as usual, which would actually release more emissions into the atmosphere going forward as we bring more native ecosystems into permanent pasture and feed cropland. Under the Eat Lancet diet, we would actually remove the equivalent of about 9 years of current CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. So for anyone who doesn't know, that's around a 70% reduction of current meat consumption in the Eat Lancet diet. And if we shift to a fully vegan plant-based diet, this increases those savings to about 16 years worth of current CO2 emissions removed from the atmosphere. So the combined impacts of that kind of food system transformation on climate, we would have, in addition to that, a 70% reduction in the sort of annual ongoing greenhouse gas emissions, so the non-CO2, the methane and the nitrous oxide emissions, in addition to that 16 years worth of current fossil fuel emissions reduced from the atmosphere through restoring lost ecosystems. The time frame of these savings varies as well. So like I said, we have the annual emissions saved plus the short-term impacts of methane removal, so that would be over the next 10 years. We would expect to see substantial reductions on temperature, in addition to those long-term impacts from the CO2 removal on temperature as well. We also have substantial impacts on biodiversity loss from that same food system transformation, reducing the land use footprint by around 60% and vegetation impacts by around 49%.
Sorry, you have 1 minute.
Of production and consumption of animal products is the most crucial enabling element in this. And I'll finish by saying we've looked at the sort of numbers from the environmental perspective, and some literature coming out to suggest that they're really important well-being benefits. So if we imagine, for example, lots more forest and sort of natural land available for us, there are likely to be some really important well-being benefits to explore as well. So finally, these issues are so incredibly urgent and the clock is ticking, but there are a number of options going forward for policymakers. So we have, like I mentioned, the COP27 coming up this year. We have the next decade of biodiversity targets also coming up this year. We have a range of national level policy levers that could be implemented, including subsidy shifts and provision of incentives around that. We also have subnational level action that could be done. In the report, we make a number of recommendations, and one of them is to really recognize the interdependence of supply and demand. So we can't just work on one side of the food system. We have to look across that to really embed that food systems approach. And we also need to look at global guidelines to really make these actions coherent across the world. There are also a number of things that corporations and the food industry could do. So, for example, partnerships. We saw Oatly partner with Swedish oat farmers, for example, to help them transition from oats for pig feed to oat milk. We also need to increase the availability and accessibility of plant-based options in the food industry and commit to sales targets and possibly having default vegan menus at conferences, for example. Consumers, of course, there's lots of things we can do as individuals. We can eat more plants. We can request more plants from places that we eat. We can talk to our political representatives about these issues, and we can contribute to public consultations. So all of those reports that I just mentioned are all publicly available, and I'm happy to share links to anybody who would be interested. Thank you so much for listening. Really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a...
Now we will continue with the question and answer session. It's a bit complicated if we are talking about translation and so on. And there is a bit of décalage. Well, not in this case. It is simultaneous translation, so don't worry about that. So we will continue with the questions. I'll start with the first question just to break the ice, and then if there are questions in streaming, online, the chat, or people here in the audience, please feel free to grab the microphone. My first question is a question to all three of the speakers, and it is regarding the topic of red meat and also the ultra-processed meat. But we have talked less about fish. Do we have enough evidence at present that fish is good for the cardiovascular health, cancer, when we know the important environmental problems of the biodiversity of the planet its consumption produces? How do you think the recommendations will evolve, if we talk about the different pollutions, if we talk about quicksilver concentrations and so on? This is a question for Carlos Gonzalez, Claudia Rocío, and Helen Harvard, for all three of you. Well, if they allow me to take the floor, Señor Carlos González is switching on the microphone. In my opinion, and according to my knowledge, when you compare intensity of the production of greenhouse emissions of different foods, fish is in an intermediate situation between what is the products of vegetable origin and red meat. That is the impact, like an average. It depends also on the way of production of the fish. It's very different if we talk about fish, which is the wild fish, fished in the sea, and through the natural ways of fishing, or if we're talking about fish farms. There are studies that have evidence that fish farm from the impact perspective is worse than what you fish in the sea. But what is called the fine wild fishing. Thinking and talking about the impact on health. There is no definitive report on cancer. Maybe tumors that can be reduced, for example, colorectal cancer, those kinds of tumors, because fish has the long chain fatty acids, and then cardiovascular diseases, and there certain impact. I'm not a specialist in cardiovascular diseases, but there are evidences also that the risk can be reduced. There are alerts that quicksilver concentration of fish can be important, but there are other specialists that the effect of quicksilver would be less, and the negative one would be less than the positive effect the consumption of fish can have on health. And then we have, of course, the different kind of types of fish. Personally, for example, if we talk about whitefish, and in my youth I have already substituted the meat by fish, and I think that nutritionists here in the room or locked in can have maybe other visions, or maybe more evidence visions. Well, I think that the question is rather difficult and complex, and I think you have given the answer I would have given. But let's continue with the next question, which is for Mrs. Helen Harvard. A question for you. It's not necessary. You're listening to the translation? Okay. Okay then, perfect. We continue. I can ask the question in Spanish. Yes, we are translating. Yes. We are translating from Spanish into English, of course. You have said, well, he is speaking now in English.
The food system, biodiversity loss will continue to accelerate. And you have some solutions, or you formulate some solutions for this. And these solutions are based on the use of 3 or 4 main levers. One is to try to make our diet more based on plant, on vegetables. The second one, and to reduce the losses. The second one is to protect and set aside more land for nature. And the third is farm in a more naturally friendly way by limiting the use of fertilizers, etc., pesticides, and water also, and replacing monoculture with polyculture farming practices. Which of these 3 levers do you think is the most important, that have to have the high priority and also easy to achieve?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. Out of those, it's really, as I mentioned, the extent to which we shift our diets towards more plant-based really defines how much we can do on those other key things. And that's because we need to actually reduce the land use for food production, and the way we can do that is to shift towards plant-based diets. If we don't do that, we basically need to keep expanding agricultural land going forward, even under business as usual diets. We'll need to bring more land to agriculture going forward, which means more loss of forests, for example. give more cultural space for the nature-friendly farming techniques compared to the current. So out of those mixture that you mentioned, it's really the diet shift, which translates into the production shift, crucially, of course, which would allow those other key measures to be implemented as well.
Thank you. La última de las preguntas que voy a hacer.
And the last question, we have almost used up our time, but I have a question for you, Claudia, regarding the following. We now have the post-COVID situation, which is the war in Ukraine. I know that you cannot look into the future, but how do you think it is going to impact us in our countries in the framework of the food insecurity? The fact that we have the war in Ukraine, how do you take it into account? Is it part of your thoughts now and in your analysis? Because in your opinion, this is going to be problematic, mostly for the emerging countries, but also in our countries. I'm convinced that it will have an impact also here. Well, yes, I agree with you. It's more anecdotal, maybe. But I think that we all have seen it during the pandemic, when certain products were lacking, were scarce, and now we have this food emergency. And then also in the media during the pandemic, and now during the starting of the war, in the first days that we're going to have a scarcity of food. Well, in that sense, what it shows us, and that is exactly what we have in a very clear picture, and all of us here see it very clearly, is this relationship between our food model, the chain, and how it is linked with this, as Dr. Helen Harvard has said, how it is linked. The type of diet is linked with the food, but not only linked with the food production, it's the whole chain and everything surrounding it. So unfortunately, the problem of food insecurity exists, and it's difficult. But it's important to look at the different strategies that are being developed and then to see how they can be implemented. There are so many initiatives in the neighborhoods, organizations that give them the possibility to have access to sustainable and proper food. Food banks, for example, here, the food bank in Barcelona is one of them. And how they're going to impact? Well, directly on our health, directly on the feeling of well-being. All those families that do not have access to food were feeling a kind of vulnerable. They were not able to achieve a proper level of food for their family. We maybe do not link well-being of a family with the lack of food, but it is very much linked. And that's also a social link. If we do not have access to certain types of food or products that allow us to have an interrelationship on a social level, then we are kind of excluded from society. So instead of thinking about this vision of the future, let's look at what we have now, look at the multidisciplinary levels we have, and look at the possible cooperations we can find to find a solution. Yes, thank you very much. I think we have surpassed a little bit the time available. Only if there is a really important question from the audience, but otherwise we have now a short break. In fact, 1:30 should be the starting moment of the next round table, but now we have a short break. See you then afterwards.